Okay, welcome back. This is part 2 of the week 4 lecture. So let's continue our history tour. We are going to move further along into the colonial period. So we're leaving the Puritans behind and we're moving into the 18th century, the 1700s. We're going to look at Phyllis Wheatley, and at least I'll mention a couple of other important writers from this later colonial period. So Wheatley is the second of the 4 major authors that we are looking at this week. And she has a lot in common with Anne Bradstreet. So as we know, Bradstreet was our first poet, our first American literary writer, and obviously our first woman writer. So in a similar way, at least published writer. In a similar way, Phyllis Wheatley is an important historical figure because she is our first published African-American writer in the future U.S. The first published African-American poet, obviously the first published African-American female poet. So like Bradstreet, she is an important trailblazer, and she has this historical significance that has long been acknowledged. But also like Bradstreet, we've sometimes dismissed her poetry and just focused on her historical significance instead. So kind of similar to what I was describing with Bradstreet. Yes, Wheatley is important. She was taught as important from a historical standpoint, but a lot of times students, at least in previous decades and previous eras, students would not have spent very much time actually reading, studying, analyzing her poetry. And there were a couple of reasons for that. Like Bradstreet, she was often sort of faulted for being so influenced by older English poets and older English poetic forms and styles. So like we talked about with Bradstreet, Wheatley was sometimes accused of being sort of derivative or imitative of older forms. Maybe not really a fair criticism, especially when we consider that Wheatley had a short writing career because she died young. She did not have a long life or a long career, so she was denied the opportunity to sort of evolve artistically in the way that Bradstreet did. So as Bradstreet got older, like we saw, and her career progressed, she kind of moved away from some of those older qualities that we can find in her earlier works. She kind of moves away from some of that older influence of the older English poets and the older English poetic forms. Wheatley doesn't quite have a chance to make that kind of progression. So certainly as a young poet, just starting out, we shouldn't be surprised that she is influenced by these older poets, and she is very much sort of imitating styles and even some subject matter that would have been popular in 18th century England as well. But keep in mind, Wheatley is publishing some of her best-known poems while she is still a teenager. She is kind of a poetic prodigy, showing a talent for poetry at a very early age, and she becomes a very accomplished poet at a very early age. So, of course, she is enslaved. When her career begins, she was brought over to the U.S. As a slave, as a young girl. She lived in the Boston area. She belonged to a pretty wealthy family, and the mistress of the house, the wife and mother of the household, taught her how to read and then sort of encouraged Wheatley to pursue learning and artistic interests. So from an early age, again, Wheatley showed this ability, but she was given access to learning and knowledge that would have been denied most slaves. So it was pretty unusual for a slave owner to allow their slaves to become literate, to gain knowledge, and we can understand why a lot of slave owners were worried that if a lot of slaves acquired literacy, the slaves would then be able to learn more about their situation, just how unjust it was, and then they would probably rise up in rebellion And of course, slave insurrections did happen pretty frequently throughout colonial and early national American history, but the slave owners feared that those revolts would become even more common if more slaves possessed basic literacy. But Wheatley goes way beyond basic literacy. I mean, she acquires that at an early age, and then she, like Bradstreet, becomes very learned. She acquires a lot of knowledge. She becomes very well-read, well-versed in other languages, and a lot of that learning shows up in her work. So a pretty famous historian, this guy, he teaches at Harvard, or at least he used to, pretty well-known academic named Henry Louis Gates Jr., a historian by trade, but he often writes about literature, particularly African-American literature. He's done some good work on Phyllis Wheatley, and he's helped to kind of change the narrative a little bit. He's helped to maybe, push people to have a little bit more appreciation for Wheatley, the poet. Not just Wheatley, the historical figure. Not just Wheatley, the inspirational figure, because she definitely is that. A young slave girl who's able to, become one of our first poets, and a very accomplished, distinguished poet at that. But not just a historical figure, not just somebody to inspire us, but also somebody who created really interesting work. Somebody who created compelling poetry that we can study and analyze today. But Gates makes the case that really at first, when her poetry first appeared in colonial Boston in the 1770s, I think, she had to prove that she was capable of writing poetry at all. So we have to remember the kinds of views that a lot of colonial Americans would have had on race back in the late 18th century. Obviously, we know that their views on race were very backwards, very factually inaccurate, and obviously highly racist. So she had to first kind of prove her humanity. A lot of white people would not have even regarded her at that time as fully human. They would have thought that maybe she represented some lesser form of humanity, but certainly not on equal footing with white people. So she had to prove that she was human, she had to prove that she was literate, and then she had to prove that she was educated enough, sophisticated enough to produce this kind of classically influenced poetry that she was writing. So Gates tells the story of how she was actually called in front of this sort of tribunal in colonial Boston, made up of these sort of local colonial officials, local leaders, of course, all older white men. And she was forced to basically testify in front of them, answer their questions, and prove that she could actually write these poems, prove that she had the knowledge, the learning, and the literary skills to actually produce the work. And ultimately, she convinced them. The authorities ruled in her favor. They determined that she was, in fact, the author of those poems, and her career sort of went from there. But Gates points out that her most famous poem, the one that I linked you to on the Poetry Foundation website on being brought from Africa to America, that's the one that most people read. That's the one that gets anthologized the most and taught the most. And he says, yeah, obviously, because it kind of represents her signature style and her signature subject matter. So the subject matter is religious piety. Like a lot of her poems, it is very religious in nature, sort of praising God, praising a larger Christian sort of world order. But there's also a little bit more going on, perhaps, than just that. And we can explore that as we go. But then talking about her signature style, heroic couplets, very much like Bradstreet, those rhyming pairs of lines that we saw before, written in iambic pentameter. So that poem is kind of a good representation of just sort of her poetry in a nutshell. But a lot of people dismissed it in previous decades as not being terribly interesting. And like I said, she got criticized a lot for being too religious. Some critics thought it was kind of strange that an enslaved person would have nothing but praise for this Christian sort of belief system that in some ways may have contributed to her enslavement. So a lot of critics wanted her to be a little bit more critical. They wanted her to maybe speak more explicitly about race relations and about the unjust treatment, that African Americans had to encounter in America. Not really interrogating her place in colonial society, not questioning things enough. These were common complaints lodged against her. But Gates argues that they're not really fair arguments, in part because she was still a very young writer, and in part because she does have things to say about race. Again, maybe she's not speaking explicitly, and maybe she's not providing really hard-hitting sort of cultural commentary or critiques, but she is interested in race relations, and she's interested in culture. So Gates says ultimately her legacy shouldn't really be determined primarily by her historical role, although that is important, her sort of historical significance. He says that's not the most important part of her legacy, and her style, the kind of, English-influenced, old-timey kind of poetic style that we find with her, that also should not be the defining feature of her legacy. Instead, Gates argues that her legacy should really be sort of defined by her interest in culture and her belief that culture, as it was constituted by religion and art, which is the way people would have thought about culture back then, largely made up of religion and different kinds of art. Her belief was that everybody, could participate in that culture, that culture really was for everyone. And that means that everyone could play a role in cultural production, and everybody could also play a role in the consumption of culture, regardless of race, regardless of, background, circumstance, place of origin. And this is a very American idea that I think we still very much have today. This idea that, or just sort of questions also surrounding like who gets to be an American, who gets to participate in American culture. We still ask some of those questions today. Who are these cultural productions for? Thinking about audience, right? And Wheatley obviously occupied a very precarious position in colonial society. She didn't have equal rights. She didn't have equal opportunities. But it's interesting to think about her own role as an artist and what she's doing as an artist. But also she's in dialogue with other artists. So that's kind of interesting too. One of the poems I posted in that PDF that you'll find in the Week 4 module is to SM, a young African painter, on seeing his works. So she's literally addressing that poem to another African American artist, a visual artist, a painter. And it's very interesting sort of what she's saying to him and how she's describing the effect that his art had on her. So she's very interested in cultural production. Who gets to take part? Who is American culture for? Who gets to participate? And I would argue, and Gates argues, that those questions are really part of a larger conversation surrounding national identity. Again, who gets to be an American? Who gets to qualify as an American? What are the parameters? What are the requirements to be an American? And do we all get equal access to culture? So those are some interesting things to consider. And Gates says that's really why she's so significant and relevant today. Yes, we can appreciate the role she plays just as a historical figure, but let's think about some of these larger questions that she's asking. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about A couple of other colonial writers. We're not going to read them, but we should at least be aware of them. So I included some of these names in those slides in the PowerPoint presentation that I mentioned before. Another important trailblazer is Samson Occam, our first published Native American writer, at least the first Native American to be published in English in the future U.S. So Occam was a member of the Mohegan tribe. I believe he was originally from modern-day Connecticut, but he converted to Christianity at a pretty early age, and he became a minister, a sort of traveling minister. He would go around to different Native American communities throughout New England, because of course by the time he comes along and he's active in the 1760s, 1770s. By then, most of the Native Americans in New England had been dispossessed of their land. Most of them were living on, reservations or sort of, separate, areas that had been set aside for them by local governments, by colonial governments. Some of them would live in towns and, local cities and towns as well, but there were sort of separate Native American communities kind of throughout the region, and Occam would visit those different communities and preach. So the text of his that I posted this week, if you have time to just check it out, it's called The Sermon at the Execution of Moses Paul. This was the first thing that Occam published. It came out in 1772. So this is when he really became the first Native American author to be published in English. And it's probably the text that he's most famous for, although now we also have his autobiography, which he wrote back in the 1770s, but it was not published until the 1980s. It was unpublished when he died, and it was only much later that it ever saw the light of day. So you can read the autobiography about him, his autobiography about himself, but also the sermon that I posted, that's representative of execution sermons, another popular genre of the time period. So I mentioned these briefly in part one, kind of a weird type of text. So I mentioned before that sermons would often be published. They were obviously designed to be delivered orally, but then they would often be set down to paper and published after the fact. But a particular sort of type of sermon was the execution sermon. So these would be delivered upon the occasion of a public execution. And public executions were very common in New England throughout the 16 and 1700s, also other parts of the colonial Americas. So these were particular sermons that were delivered right before the convicted criminal, the condemned criminal, would be hanged. I think public hanging was their preferred method. So this is the sermon that Occam delivers at the execution of Moses Paul, who was another Native American, a Christianized Native American who had been convicted of murder. So this is a really interesting genre. We don't have a lot of time to devote to it, but many critics and scholars have argued that execution sermons help to sort of develop the modern day genre of crime fiction. Because at first these were very godly and just sort of focused on the moral lesson that could be gathered from this criminal's story and the terrible end that the criminal was going to meet. But later execution sermons would become increasingly salacious, and they would be really focused on the sort of lurid, often violent details of the criminal's crimes. So they would really focus more on the crimes and less on the actual, potential salvation or the moral lesson at work or whatever. So they became increasingly focused on the criminal activity. And that's what a lot of people were interested in. That's what a lot of readers wanted. So execution sermons were a part of this larger body of literature surrounding criminals that were it was really a lot of popular stuff back in the 16 and 1700s. Ballads, what they called broadsheets, which were almost like kind of primitive newspapers that would have a bunch of stories about criminals and their crimes, and also execution sermons. So some historians would argue that all of that stuff kind of contributed contributed to our modern day crime fiction. You know, detective stories, gangster movies, all of that stuff can kind of be traced back to this period, and execution sermons were part of that development. So Occam is another important historical figure, and he was active during this same kind of late colonial period. And, you know, there's a few other names that you can look at, but I just kind of want to move on to the early Republic. So like I said, this era begins right after independence. So we could start with Crevicore and Letters from an American Farmer. This is a very famous book. I often wonder if I should incorporate it into this class. I kind of feel like I should. It's not technically literature, but then again, neither is Cabeza de Vaca, so that's not really a good reason. But Crevicore writes that book in this, well, it's published in the 1780s. I have a tough time classifying it. He wrote it during the colonial period, but it was published right before or right after the American Revolution ended. I think on the slide I have it under the early Republic, but we could just as easily call it a colonial text because really it was written during this same late colonial period in which Wheatley and Occam are writing. So Crevicore is kind of an interesting guy. He was born in France. He comes over to modern day New York, like not New York City, but more like kind of upstate New York, I think. Maybe kind of close to New York City, but not the city itself, more a little bit north. And he settles there and he, you know, kind of runs his own farm and he's pretty successful, but he also travels throughout the colonies and he compiles these letters. And they're really very observational in nature. He's observing different aspects of colonial life. These are kind of like, he writes these sort of like narrative essays, would be probably the best way to describe them. Again, they're not really literature, but they are kind of literary. He's obviously influenced by a lot of literature that he's read. So he's a good writer. He knows how to spin a narrative. He has a lot of descriptive detail, but he's really depicting life in the colonies. And he's kind of exploring a lot of stuff that we might categorize as kind of part of the American dream. This idea of like exploring why people came here. Why did people immigrate to the colonies? And he had his own story to kind of draw upon, but he also talks to a lot of other people and learns their origin stories. What brought you here? What are you hoping to build here? What do you want? What does this new place represent to you? So this whole idea of sort of self-making, remaking yourself. We talked about this with Cabeza de Vaca, but that idea is very operative in Crevicore. He's very interested in that. People can come over here and build a new life. They can build a new identity. So there's a lot of good associated with that, but he also identifies some potential problems with that. And he also identifies differences between regions. So he travels to the south, he's in the north, he goes to some of the mid-Atlantic states, and he's noticing differences between these different colonies, differences between different kinds of Americans, because by this point, there are some regional characteristics that are kind of becoming clear, right? Differences between Southerners and Northerners, differences in culture, differences in worldview. And he's kind of horrified by some of the practices that he encounters in the South, in states that were still slave states, or colonies that, you know, where chattel slavery was perhaps more prevalent than it was in the part of the colonies where he lived. So Crevicore is an important guy, again, sort of interrogating what the American dream really means and how it functions, and both the good parts of it and maybe the bad. And again, he's an immigrant himself, a French-American writer, but he did write in English. So that's, yeah, he's 1780s, and then we can move up to a few other important figures from the early Republic era. And we're going to actually read a few of these other figures. But I want to talk a little bit about Susanna Ralston. And then we're going to talk about Freneau and Brackenridge. Those are the third and fourth authors that we are covering this week. Both of those guys are kind of hard to categorize because they were both writing during the colonial period and they continued to write up into the early Republic period. So they kind of span the gap between the two. But I also just want to spend a moment on Susanna Ralston because we're not going to read her. We might talk about her a little bit more next week when we get into the Coquette, because her book, her bestseller, Charlotte Temple, which came out in 1791, has a lot in common with The Coquette by Hannah Webster Foster, which we start reading next week. So Ralston is our first best-selling author. So a lot of scholars would say we need to get her into this class because Charlotte Temple was the first best-selling novel in U.S. history. But what gets tricky is the fact that Ralston, like Bradstreet, was originally from England, and she immigrated to the U.S., to the future U.S., as a young adult, and lived most of the remainder of her life in the U.S., but she did go back to England. She was kind of back and forth. She kind of had this almost dual identity, kind of split evenly between the country of her birth and the country where she spent most of her adult years. So Ralston's just a very interesting figure. I wish we could do more with her. She wasn't just a writer, she was also an actress. She later managed a theater company. She was really an entrepreneur in a lot of ways. She later opened a few schools for girls, helped to educate young women. She married a musician who was kind of a drunk and a gambler, and he often sort of frittered away a lot of their money. So she was the primary breadwinner of the family. She supported the family with her writing and with her acting. So that's kind of, again, kind of unique for the period. And Charlotte Temple was a massively popular novel, not just here, but also in England, where it is actually set for the most part. The characters actually leave England and come to the U.S. It's set during the American Revolution, but the main character is a young English girl who falls for a rakish army officer who's fighting for the British crown in the U.S., and it's largely her story. It's a heartbreaking story. It's a sentimental novel, and we're going to talk a lot more about that genre next week when we start on the Coquette. But a lot of sentimental novels had similar storylines. They were often about young women who were abandoned or mistreated by young, sort of deceitful men, frequently referred to as rakes back then. A rake would have been a good-looking, sort of dashing young man who was often focused on pleasure and had no intention of marrying the girl that he was with, but he might lead her on to think that. So these were all very common tropes and character types, not just in America, but, you know, in England. Sentimental novels had been popular really since the beginning of the 18th century. Some of the earliest novels ever written in the English language were sentimental novels with plots very similar to what I just described in Charlotte Temple. So it wasn't really artistically innovative. It was a very common type of story. And a lot of these sentimental novels were targeted largely towards female readers, young women, and there was supposed to be a sort of moral lesson included. Like, you have to, guard your virtue. You have to be very careful not to be misled by rakes, essentially. So we'll talk a lot more about that stuff next week, but just remember who Ralston is, because Charlotte Temple comes out in 1791. It's a massive hit both in England and here. So it really is our first bestseller, and it would remain the best-selling American novel until the 1850s, until Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe just a few years before the Civil War breaks out. So think about that. Charlotte Temple remained the best-selling work of literature in the U.S. for nearly 70 years. So that's a pretty impressive legacy. I wrestled with whether or not we should read it. Ultimately, I decided we should read The Coquette because it's just a better book. It's a better example, a more fun reading experience, I think, and still a very good example of that sentimental genre that I'm describing. But yes, Ralston does achieve a level of success that no other American writer had previously achieved. So again, she wasn't super famous in the way that maybe we would think of like famous writers today. Yeah, that book was big. Not everybody even knew that she was the author of that book, but that book was big. There was even kind of a fan club, like people would sort of treat the title character, Charlotte Temple, as if she was a real person. So very much like fandom exists today, it was sort of like that back then as well. And I'll mention a little bit more about that next week. So Ralston is writing throughout the 1790s up into the very early 1800s. So she's a notable figure from this same period. But now let's get to Freneau and then Brackenridge. So I asked you guys to read 3 poems by Freneau. The first is The House of Night, a rather lengthy Gothic poem that he's probably best known for. It's about 22 pages, or at least 21 pages if you print it out. That's your call, but I did post the PDF. And then I linked you to a couple of shorter poems by him, The Indian Burying Ground and On the Religion of Nature. So Freneau was not a very successful writer during his lifetime, but we've come to appreciate his work much more since his death. And that's also a recurring theme that we're going to notice as we move into the 19th century later on. But Freneau, his father was a French Huguenot. His mother, I want to say, was Scottish. He's originally from New York City, was born into a pretty wealthy family. He attended what was then called New Jersey College. Now it's known as Princeton. And he was classmates with Brackenridge there. They were buddies. They were college classmates at Princeton. But yeah, Freneau did a lot of different things during his life. He was a ship captain at one point. He managed a couple and edited a couple of like literary journals and magazines. But his own writing was not terribly successful then. But now we recognize that he was doing a lot of important work, especially if we're thinking about this project of creating a national literature that was distinct from English literature or French literature, or these other sort of older European models. You can especially see that in the 2 short poems, The Indian Burying Ground and The Religion of Nature. Notice that he's kind of trying to build this original conception of American history and American mythology. Look at, particularly in The Indian Burying Ground, you know, he's explicitly framing Native Americans as an ancient race with a culture and a history all their own. And he's one of the first American writers to really recognize, or at least make it clear, that in America, our ancient history is Native American history. Remember Sidney Smith and some of those criticisms about American culture and American literature. One thing a lot of Europeans said back then was that, oh, Americans don't have a history. They're a brand new country. Everything over there is new. That's part of the reason that they don't have a literature. It's because they don't have a history. But Freneau recognizes that, no, we do have a history. It's just not a white history. It's a Native American history. But he becomes very interested in Native American culture, some of their practices. I don't know that he was necessarily super knowledgeable about some of those things, but he was interested. Unlike a lot of his contemporaries who, frankly, weren't, or at least they did not explore a lot of that stuff in their writing, but Freneau does. So that's a bit novel for the time period. So he's trying to establish these kind of deep links with an ancient native past, but he's also directly comparing that ancient native past with other old stuff from Europe and other parts of the world. And he's doing that very deliberately. So at one point he compares a, quote, restless Indian queen. And again, he's still sort of using this old kind of European terminology, but that was common. But he's comparing the restless Indian queen to the Queen of Sheba, which is a figure from the Bible, a figure that European readers would have been very familiar with, they would have recognized. So he's staking a claim to America possessing our own mythology. We have our own ancient history, just like Europe does, just like Africa does, the Middle East, Asia, all these other parts of the world. We have it too. It's just a little different over here, but we have it, and we can draw upon it to create literature. So I'm not sure if he's the very first one to ever do that, but we regard him as one of the early American writers to do that, to draw on a Native American past to help create a new national literature and culture. And as we'll see, other writers come along later and they sort of continue that same project. And again, this matters. This matters because during this time period, we were often described as not having a history. So, yeah, he's doing that in the short poems. He's also doing it in the House of Night. So this is another great example of what we've been talking about. He's very much borrowing some older European artistic forms here. This is a Gothic poem that owes a lot to earlier Gothic work from England. Gothic literature, you know, the scary castle, the dark rainy night, the personification of death. All of that was pretty common in Gothic literature back in England, and that was a popular genre throughout the 18th century. So Fresneau's working on The House of Night initially in the 1770s, so it's still the colonial period. I think it's first published in 1779, but then later he shortens it. He revised it, I think, in the 1780s, and a new revised version comes out in 1786, but then later he shortens it, and a new sort of abridged version comes out in the 1790s. I'm pretty sure the version we are looking at here is the 1786 version, so it's revised but not yet shortened. And you might argue that it was a good idea for him to eventually shorten this poem. Let's see. Yeah, I think we have the 1786, but I might be getting that wrong. You guys double check that. It should be made clear in the introduction in that PDF, or maybe some of the footnotes. But anyway, I want you guys to notice that, okay, yeah, he's importing this old form, okay, Gothic literature, he's importing that over here, but he's adapting it to a uniquely U.S. setting. So notice in the poem that he mentions some specific places in America. He mentions this specific U.S. setting. You know, American fauna, American trees, the Chesapeake Bay, the Appalachian Mountains, okay, actual geographic features of the U.S., things that are unique and distinctive about the U.S. But again, he's engaged in this sort of larger comparison work. He compares a lot of that stuff to older things from the old world. Like, I think he compares the Appalachians to other mountain ranges that one can find in Europe or Asia, like Mount Ararat, which has biblical significance. I think it's in modern-day Turkey, but it gets mentioned in the Bible. And he mentions the Andes, which, of course, that's in South America. He mentions the Alps. That's a famous European mountain range. So he has a sort of rhetorical goal here. He's really making an argument. He's saying, look, we have ancient history and we have cool, unique landscapes just like other parts of the world. We have these distinctive features that have their own mythology sort of surrounding them, just like other parts of the world. So he's really staking out the importance and just the existence of an American culture. It's still kind of in its infancy, but he is pointing the way to sort of drawing on our own past, our own geography, to create this new national literature. And like I said, a lot of future authors will follow his lead. Okay, so I want to wrap things up with Hugh Henry Brackenridge, Fresneau's old college buddy. Like a lot of these other figures, and I think it's important to note this, Brackenridge was not a professional writer. Not on like a real full-time basis. And that's true of Fresneau. That's true of most of these other writers that we've mentioned. You have to remember, in the 18th century in America, we didn't yet have professional writers in the modern sense. We had people writing, publishing all kinds of different things, history, theology, also literature. But a lot of the people producing those texts, they had like day jobs. You know, writing was a side gig. It was something they did largely as a hobby or largely, you know, just to kind of circulate amongst friends and family. And if they published, fine. That was kind of a nice little thing to have on the side. Maybe they could earn a little bit of money, but largely they would have some other primary means of earning an income. So, for example, Brackenridge was a judge. He went into the legal profession after his college days, became a lawyer, and later a judge in Western Pennsylvania. So that was his primary job, and he just wrote in his free time. And he never became wildly successful as a literary figure, but people did kind of know who he was in that sort of early national period. He wrote a lot, not just literature. But what we have from him this week is just a small excerpt from a novel that he wrote. Really, it took him a long time to write it. It's a very long book called Modern Chivalry. He started it in the 1790s, okay, but he was still writing it throughout the first decade and a half of the 19th century. So the first 2 volumes of the book appeared in 1792, just 1 year after the bestseller Charlotte Temple came out. And then the 3rd volume came out soon after. The 4th volume came out like in 1797. But then he embarked on part 2. And he didn't start writing part 2 of the novel until like the early 1800s. I think the first part of part 2 came out in 1804, and then he wasn't finished with it really until 1815, shortly before he died. So obviously, we are not reading the whole thing. We are just going to get a small sample of Brackenridge's style. He's very much a satirist. This is a satirical novel. And just like these poets, he's very much influenced by older English models, older English satirical writers like Jonathan Swift. Some of you might know him. He was actually Irish, I think. He wrote A Modest Proposal, kind of a famous example of satirical writing. Also, Lawrence Sterne was a well-known English satirical novelist. He wrote the book Tristram Shandy, which is kind of famous. They made a movie out of it. That was a famous English satirical novel, and you can see that Brackenridge is definitely influenced by it. And he's also very much influenced by the Spanish novel Don Quixote, which came out in the early 1600s. Many people would point to that as the first modern novel ever produced in the Western world. Obviously, it was written in Spanish. Many of you might be familiar with it. You can always find good translations. It's worth reading because it's surprisingly modern. for being such an old novel. But really, Brackenridge is lifting the plot of modern chivalry largely from Don Quixote. Just like in Don Quixote, we have sort of an older bachelor gentleman who has a lot of time on his hands, and he decides to go on some adventures and some journeys along with his faithful servant. In this case, it's Teague O'Regan or O'Regan. And they get into various misadventures. But what's interesting about Don Quixote, though, is that the nobleman who is the centerpiece of that narrative, he's, again, kind of got all this time on his hands. He's just kind of hanging out, doesn't have anything to do. But his mind has become corrupted by reading medieval romances, like chivalric romances about knights and damsels in distress and fighting dragons. So Don Quixote reads all of those books, and he becomes convinced that he's like an old-timey knight, and he needs to go out and rescue people and fight monsters and kind of reenact the storylines of these old sort of medieval romances that even by the 1600s were considered kind of old-fashioned. So that element is kind of missing from modern chivalry, but the basic setup of the well-born gentleman and his servant traveling around the countryside, getting into comic adventures, that's very much lifted from Don Quixote. So Brackenridge is very influenced by these older European writers, but once again, he's adapting those old forms to uniquely American subject matter. So even if you can just get through those first two books, which I think equal maybe about 60 pages in the electronic version of the book that I've linked you to, you'll notice that Brackenridge is kind of grappling with like what democracy looks like in this new nation. And yes, he's kind of making fun of a lot of American citizens, particularly rural people who kind of live in this sort of backwoods districts. He is making fun of a lot of common people, but he's also making fun of the elites, the people who have power, political power, economic power, influence, like Farrago, like Captain Farrago, who's supposed to be our voice of reason, our sort of moral authority. We quickly learn that he's kind of a buffoon. I mean, he's like, we're supposed to laugh at him just as much as we're supposed to laugh at Teague or anybody else. So Brackenridge's satire really sort of cuts in all directions. But you guys, maybe you've learned a little bit about satire as a literary genre. I think most of us know kind of generally what the word means. And we often apply the word to a lot of different types of art. But back in the 1700s, satire really was a specific literary genre. And again, it was very popular in England and other parts of Great Britain. And it was usually in the form of fiction, although there could be satirical poems, and Alexander Pope wrote some of them as well. But they were often in prose form. They were often, novels. And traditionally, what satire is supposed to do is it's supposed to kind of expose certain problems or issues in a society, certain failings, certain things that aren't working properly. And yes, the surface level goal is just to kind of make fun of it all, to kind of treat it all like a joke, and to find humor in the hypocrisy and the incompetence that might be on display. So yes, it has that sort of humorous function, but in classic satire, there would have been a larger goal. Not only do you want the audience to laugh at the ridiculous stuff on display, you also want to try to fix the problem or the issue that you are calling attention to. So ultimately, satire is supposed to kind of lead to reform or some kind of, progress. That's usually the way it was thought of. So the target of Brackenridge's satire at times just seems to be our entire democratic system. He's a little bit suspicious of democracy. He supports it. He's on board with it in a general sense, but he also recognizes some real challenges that it might pose. I have a fun quote. I'm trying to find it. Some critics said that he was Brackenridge both supported and distrusted democracy, which sounds contradictory, but that's actually the view of a lot of our founders. A lot of our founders worried about certain excesses that might occur if we gave common people too much power. There were some concerns that, the sort of classic social order, the kinds of hierarchies that were still enforced in our country, even though we were democratic and more free, some of us were more free than our predecessors in Europe, but there was still a hierarchy, right? Well-born, affluent, educated people were in charge. And the rural, uneducated people who didn't have a lot of money or influence, they were kind of expected to take orders to a certain extent. So most of you know, when our country was founded, only white male landowners initially were allowed to vote. So there was still very much a hierarchy in place. And we're kind of interrogating that hierarchy in this book. We're only going to see a little bit of that, but you will notice that, we're laughing at the common people, but if Farrago represents an authority figure, we're also laughing at authority, and we laugh at doctors, and we laugh at scholars, and we laugh at religious leaders throughout the book. Nobody is safe from Brackenridge's satire. So again, He's a supporter of democracy, but he's exploring some of these issues, these problems with potentially giving more power to more people. And this idea that, what's going to happen in a truly democratic society? What's going to happen to the notion of social classes? Because class mattered back then. It still mattered, even in a supposedly free society. So what happens if we level some of those differences between the classes? And, well-born, wealthy guys like Brackenridge were often a little bit nervous about that, just in general. But he's also kind of giving us an interesting snapshot of what America looked like right after independence. So again, the very beginning of this era of the early republic. And he's exploring a lot of institutions and activities that would have been thought of as kind of quintessentially American. Again, as we're starting to create our own identity, our own culture. So a lot of these things are on display in the book. So like horse racing was increasingly associated with the young republic. Also the theater, election rallies. There's some really funny stuff going on with election rallies. Congress, philosophical societies, universities, the church, even sort of like concepts like romantic courtship or dueling. If two men had a problem with one another, they might resort to a duel. And we see that made fun of also in the text. You guys aren't going to get that far, I don't think, but ultimately Farrago is challenged to a duel, and he tries to get Teague to go in his place. So it's a pretty funny book. I hope you guys can appreciate a little bit of the humor, even if you're not able to read very much. You'll notice the sort of episodic quality as they travel and get into these different mishaps, these different scrapes and misadventures. So it's supposed to be funny. But again, I think Brackenridge is interested in some stuff that remains relevant to us. Again, questions of class, questions of who has the power. Should we have hierarchies, or should we have everything kind of leveled and flat where everybody's on totally equal footing? Also, he's kind of interested in how we're going to integrate all of these different kinds of people. That's very much a question that's pertinent to America and the development of an American culture. So Teague is an Irish immigrant. Brackenridge himself was actually born in Scotland. But then when he was very young, his family moved to western Pennsylvania, what is now Pittsburgh. He was largely based in Pittsburgh back when it was still kind of the frontier, because western Pennsylvania during the colonial period and the early national period, that was about as far west as we had gotten. So he's interested in the relationships between centers of power and rural communities. So in western Pennsylvania, there was this big insurrection in the 1790s known as the Whiskey Rebellion. Some of you might have learned about that in an American history class. It was the biggest domestic insurrection prior to the Civil War. And Brackenridge played kind of an interesting role. He wasn't one of the ones rebelling, but it happened in western Pennsylvania, and it was largely rural farmers from around what is now kind of Pittsburgh. They were very angry at the state government, which was at that time still based in Philadelphia on the Atlantic seaboard, very far away from western Pennsylvania. So they felt like they were not really represented by the state government in Philadelphia. They didn't think they were being listened to. Nobody cared about them. And then they got really pissed when the state passed a new, or it might have been a federal tax on a lot of the grains that would be necessary for the making of alcohol. So these grains, like, I don't know, wheat or corn, whatever. I don't know much about distillation, but these farmers were growing the grains that would later be used to make liquor. So there was what was called a whiskey tax was placed on those grains, and the farmers thought that was very unfair. It was affecting their livelihood, and they thought it was being done by clueless bureaucrats in Philadelphia and D.C. who didn't know anything about western Pennsylvania and their way of life. So Brackenridge, being an important judge in that region, he was sort of called upon to be a mediator between the government and these angry farmers. But what's funny is neither side really trusted him. The government thought that he was too sympathetic to the farmers because he agreed that it wasn't fair for them. They were struggling to get by as is. He didn't think the tax was fair, and he kind of agreed with their points, but he did not support the insurrection. But the farmers didn't trust him because he was an elite. He was a well-born gentleman who had gone to Princeton, and now he was a judge, and he had money, and he had influence. So they didn't want anything to do with him either. So in his typical sort of fashion, he was trying to crack jokes. He wrote a bunch of like editorials in local newspapers, trying to kind of make fun of both sides, trying to use humor to try to, sort of quiet the storm. And there's a famous quote, I don't know who said it, but it appeared in some newspaper of the time. It said, "Brackenridge laughs alone." So a lot of his efforts to use humor to diffuse the tension are considered to have been failures. But we kind of see him doing some similar stuff in modern chivalry, using humor, using comedy to actually do stuff, to actually get things done. And in the case of the novel, it's kind of a democratic experiment. It's a literary democratic experiment, exploring democracy as it looked in these early days of an independent U.S. So, again, just try to get a taste of Brackenridge's style. It is going to feel very old-fashioned, but try to detect the humor. And also notice that his narrator is highly unreliable. He tells us in the very beginning that he doesn't care about subject matter. He's just using the book to practice style, and that's obviously not meant to be taken seriously, but the narrator is kind of a character himself, and we have these little chapters where the narrator is just kind of they're like either called reflections or observations, where he's just kind of musing, thinking about various issues. You guys might not have a chance to read many of those, but those are the chapters where Brackenridge stops being so goofy and really starts to wrestle with important questions about the law and about, how are we going to assimilate Native Americans? Like, what are we going to do about the slavery issue? Brackenridge lived to see Pennsylvania, his home state, abolish slavery. And other states were doing that as well, but of course the southern states were not. So there was this issue of, okay, can we have a country where some states allow it and some states don't? So he's kind of wrestling with that. He's wrestling with a lot of larger sort of philosophical or historical questions. And those chapters contain some really interesting content, but they're a little bit more academic, a little bit less entertaining than the adventures of Farago and Teague. But again, a little bit modern, just like Don Quixote is. We're not going to get far enough to see this, but much later, I want to say it's in the 3rd volume, Teague has become kind of a celebrity. And what critics call Teague mania has swept through the countryside, and people start calling Teague Major O'Regan. And that's one rank higher than captain, which is what everybody calls Farago. So Farago gets pissed, and you'll notice that a lot of the humor comes from Farago trying to talk Teague out of things. Like Teague is recruited to a philosophical society. At one point, he's encouraged to run for Congress, and Farago makes fun of him and basically says, "You're too stupid and low-born to do any of that stuff. You're not qualified. It's not meant for you." And we can laugh at Teague, but we also laugh at Farago because Farago is a liar. He's often really ignorant and uninformed. So ultimately, we realize that he's no more qualified than Teague. It's sort of the blind leading the blind. We can laugh at everybody. And that's just kind of what Brackenridge likes to do. But again, an interesting snapshot of America right after the Revolution, trying to sort of figure everything out. And I think we're still trying to figure some of that stuff out, even today. Okay, so that's enough for this week. I appreciate your patience. Next week will be a lot more literary. We are going to focus a lot more on analysis and doing close work with one specific text. So we are starting on the Coquette. I need you guys to try to finish the entire book next week. That shouldn't be terribly difficult because it's pretty short. It's a quick read. I really like it. I hope you guys enjoy it. So we will start on that next week. If you have any questions, let me know. If not, I'll see you soon.